My full-time day job is the head of Spark, which is a NGO in India that works with a very large social movement called the National Slum Dwellers Federation, which brings together informal slum communities all over India that began with fighting evictions and are now looking at sustainable solutions that ensure they are included in the city.
In what ways do you mean included in the city?
As you know, in most of the global south, the city comprises of the formal city and the informal city. And increasingly, people are being pushed into the informal city as formal jobs shrink and more of production services become available through informal means.
So what do you mean by informal in this?
So let's take the courier business. Formal postal services are shrinking worldwide, and you have courier businesses. You have people who run around on bicycles and scooties giving you your snail mail. Where do you think all the sorting happens? Where do you think all these young people who ride these motorbikes come from? They come from the slums. And they work on some form of a daily wage, self-employed sort of process. So it's outside the formal structure.
So is that a problem? I mean, isn't it good that people are showing initiative?
Well, along with informal livelihoods come informal habitats. So you have slums, which are survival strategies of poor people to build houses for themselves in the modest incomes that they have that form slums. And for a very long time, slums have somehow invisibly coexisted with the formal city. But as real estate and value of land become more and more the basis of reformulating cities and getting cities into the global map where everybody wants shining, pretty cities, slums are getting pushed out, and the laws of planning and the rules and regulations and norms and standards of safety and all these virtuous things make this habitation unacceptable. And rather than saying, now what can the communities and the cities do to change that, people just get evicted.
So they become more and more invisible.
There are political moves in all our countries to try and create conditions by which we are able to provide social protection. So there are discussions about health insurance and other things. But they don't seem to reach the poor. So there's a mismatch between the rhetoric and fiscal allocations that governments make and the access to the really poor people who don't have any of that.
So what are you doing in your groups, Sheela?
So we all the social movements of the poor in India and our international network, which is the Slum Dwellers International, started off by poor men and women fighting evictions and fighting for the right to survive in the city. And it was all protest and anger. And interestingly, the women in these movements said, we have to stop fighting and we have to start negotiating because we have nowhere else to go. And so communities began to form institutional arrangements through which they began to think of the kind of solutions that they face. Where are you?
People are saying, "Kalas, enough. We've had it." And right now, I think, when I look at this tone of the World Economic Forum, for example, I think to a large extent we are all sleepwalking into a crisis of epic proportions, right? That in fact the unwillingness to actually understand how people on the ground are feeling and how marginalized, and the anger levels, frustration levels and so on is going to come back and haunt the power brokers in a place like that.
See, it sounds a bit like you're talking, Sheela, about having more voice at the bottom-up level, the horizontal level. But with the climate change negotiations, for instance, which is where we last talked to you, it doesn't seem to be making an impact.
In cities, Poor people are living in the most wretched places that flood all the time, that have landslides. So climate change is also about that.
Absolutely.
So how can you take something, like all of us say that in climate there's the green, blue and the brown agenda. The brown agenda is not sexy. Doesn't tickle everybody's imagination, but it affects people on a day-to-day situation. So now we're grappling to say, how can we own that? How can we bring the things that matter to people every day into what is picking up the imagination? Because ultimately, unless there's a connection, there's no negotiation. And we all know in social movements that just protest doesn't produce impact. People can pretend to listen to you, appease you, say you are very nice, and then forget about you.
So can you give an example of somewhere where people have made a difference now?
Well, everything's happening in bits and bobs. There's no magical, one of the other things here is everybody's talking about scale and sustainability. First you have to survive. Then you can talk, about other things. So when communities begin to look at their own problems and give them and interpret it in perspectives and language that those that they are negotiating with understand, then you start a process. So we are now jumping into a lot of the IPCC work related to adaptation and saying, what about the poor in the city? How are you going to get their voices in? How are we going to ensure that when cities map vulnerability, it doesn't become a good way to kick them out? Now, even that's a victory that we have been able to bring in. So whenever anybody does anything, we say, we want to come in, we want to make sure, and if a city evicts somebody in the whole thing that it's unsafe, we'll start shouting and screaming, because you cannot do that without working out an alternative. So those are the kinds of changes that are beginning. We are beginning to talk with mayors' associations to say, you use these people for votes. What's your accountability to them? Your cities are informal. Your markets are informal. What's wrong with you? You're giving all the places, you're evicting people and creating malls that nobody can go and buy anything on. What's the sustainability in that model? Now, those are the questions we have learned to start asking, because we never connected our problems with that before.
Well, I think if we are brutally honest about the impact of social movements, trade unions, NGOs, even progressive faith efforts and so on, at best we can say, when we look at the broad justice agenda and include climate change in that, at best we can say we are winning some important battles, but we are patently losing the planet or losing the war. If I look at last year, what we were seeing, we were winning many important battles against big corporates who were driving environmental destruction.
Can you give an example? An
example would be around water pollution in China, right, where the Yangtze and the Pearl rivers are being heavily contaminated by the supply chain of companies like Nike, Puma, Adidas, H&M, and so on, using in their supply chain, companies that just dump pollutants into these rivers. Now we were able to use our global nature, using online and offline, right, to actually get pressure on the companies that were partnering with certain entities in China and got them to agree in a short space of time that over the next 5-6 years they will phase out, pollutants that are going into the rivers and so on. Now the impact on the Chinese government saw what we did, and then they've now drawn up a list of banned substances, and they are saying
excellent
that even if it's not explicitly outlawed by the law, that if there is a negative impact, the polluter pays principle must kick in, right? So, but the important thing I think is how we mobilize is changed fundamentally as a result of the whole email, internet environment. But, people talk about this activism as cyber activism or clicktivism. Some people say, well, clicktivism is slacktivism. But if you're a cyber activist in Syria right now, nobody can say you're slacking, right? So its context is really important. But at the end of the day, I think much as Greenpeace and other movements are using social media very effectively right now, we would make a mistake to think we can strengthen social movements and build them by putting all our eggs in the social media basket. We cannot get away, as Sheela and others are saying, from conventional face-to-face organizing. And let's not undermine and underplay the fact that there is still a deep, deep digital divide, right? And many of the constituencies that we want to have voice and to be engaged are outside of that digital world. That might change in the next 5 years if mobile telephony becomes more sophisticated and people on cheaper phones can get better internet access and so on. But actually, we're really not there. And don't forget that when we look at people who suffer in this planet, from homeless, so if you were to draw a map of the world and say, let's put all the homeless people and draw a circle where they are. Then you say all the people who do not have access to clean drinking water, those that don't have access to sanitation, those that suffer gender-based violence. You'll find, or those that are not literate, who cannot, even if they have the technology, will not be able to, access it because of being historically, educationally disenfranchised. What you will find, those circles overlap. People suffer multiple levels of exclusion. And one of the criticisms, I think we must be honest as civil society, is that we also mimic and mirror the kind of siloed thinking that comes from governments. We have to begin to recognize that we will never have the impact that we need if we don't follow what the women's movement taught us some decades ago, which is this whole notion of intersectionality. And that is understanding how different issues, class, race, gender, ability, and so on, how different variables, if you want, or different sectors of struggle are connected. Because bottom line is, if you take the trade union movement is coming extremely close to the NGO movement on climate change because we've been dialoguing about actually we can turn the crisis of climate change into an opportunity if we can get governments to move decisively in the direction of creating enabling legislative environments to promote a move to a green, renewable technology-based economy. The job creation potential there is much more. The decency of the work would be much more. If you look at coal, for example, coal kills not just the workers but the people who live around coal plants and so on. So, in fact, the elephant in the room is why, right, after so long, everything that people like Sheela and I say here, let's be clear, people here have heard it before. It's not as if they've not heard it, right? But why is there a lack of urgency to move when in fact we've won the debate?
Yeah,
right?
It's not an intellectual deficit.
It's an issue about power and who holds power, right? And at the moment, when you look at the United States, where every member of Congress has 3 to 4 full-time lobbyists targeted at them, paid for by the oil, coal and gas industry to make sure that climate legislation doesn't go through, we need to ask, well, why are they able to get away with it? And also question the quality of democracy. I mean, I would say that today the US democracy could be described as the best democracy fossil fuel money can buy. Right? No, I mean, the contamination of our politics by moneyed interests has to be challenged. And we have to also begin to challenge ourselves about what history teaches us about how change happens. And history teaches us, the last point, history teaches us, whether it's a US civil rights movement, anti-apartheid, women's right to vote, and any number we can go and look at. Change only comes when decent men and women say, enough is enough and no more. We're prepared to go to prison if necessary. We're prepared to put our lives on the line if necessary. And I would say that when the world is in such a precarious and vulnerable situation, the time has come for us to actually embrace civil disobedience much more, because that seems to be what has a greater power to get those with power to actually listen more effectively.